Hello and welcome to episode 2 of 5-Year Windows on the Movie Gold YouTube channel. I'm your host, Kyle McNevin. Each week this series focuses on a specific 5-year period of an actor's career by looking at all of their movies released during that time. On this week's episode, we'll be looking at the career of Denzel Washington from 1991 to 1995. Prior to 91, Denzel Washington had already achieved a great deal of acclaim in movies like Cry Freedom, For Queen and Country, and The Mighty Quinn, before most notably winning the Best Supporting Actor Oscar for his work in Glory. As he's entering the 90s, he's exploded on the scene and people are excited to see what he's going to do next when he gets that opportunity to start leading films of his own. For someone breaking onto the scene like he has, you would expect that he's about to go on this run where he's going to be strictly playing the leading man of every movie for the next 5 to 10 years. What else does he have to prove? In an interview from July of 1990 with the LA Times, Washington even said, quote, "The first thing I try to do is make good movies. As for what the significance of that will be, we'll see." Sure, during this period we're going to see him play the undeniable lead of some of these films, but it also has a healthy dose of supporting performances where it backs up the claim that he is simply trying to be in good movies. That kind of humility is so refreshing to see and quite frankly makes for a much more interesting career to talk about, because it does have the variety, and we can see just how malleable he is as an actor. For the most part, I'll be talking about the broad strokes of Washington's movies during this 91 to 95 run. However, I may delve into spoiler territory about some of the movies, so be warned, I may be talking in detail about the following films: Ricochet, Mississippi Masala, Malcolm X, Much Ado About Nothing, Pelican Brief, Philadelphia, Crimson Tide, Virtuosity, and Devil in a Blue Dress. The first film of this run was Ricochet, directed by Russell McKay and released on October 4th, 1991. As a first-time watch for me, I didn't have super high expectations, but I deduced that I was at least going to enjoy the experience since John Lithgow is one of my favorite actors and he happens to be playing a serial killer here. At first, this seems like a down-the-middle revenge thriller with Denzel Washington playing a police officer that has apprehended serial killer Lithgow. But now, years later, Lithgow has escaped prison and is seeking revenge. However, following the prison escape, the plot that Lithgow has put together seems a lot more sinister. The film reaches beyond the usual scope of a revenge thriller, because not only does Lithgow physically torture Washington to some degree after kidnapping him, but then as he is able to successfully drag the reputation of Washington through the mud. It was around this time that my interest in the Washington plotline really peaked. The star of the show up to this point had been Lithgow. Every line he has is just a little extra quippy, but he's delivering it in this very serious way that comes off as sinister, and he's an even daunting physical presence. In one scene, he has donned this phone book armor before taking down one of the toughest guys in prison. For the first half of the movie, Washington is doing the job by portraying this golden boy that seems to be invincible and can do no wrong in the eyes of the public. But once the media starts to turn on him, Washington is able to play this downward spiral so well. He is a man with supreme confidence in himself naturally. Plus, he knows he didn't do anything wrong. But even his own wife has turned on him and doesn't believe him. So now, this is a story of him having to not only get revenge upon Lithgow, but prove his own innocence in the process. And that's one of those roles that could really get eaten up by other actors. But here, Washington is playing it down the middle and using his own natural charisma, and that is what is able to propel this into one of those movies that rises above just a little schlocky revenge thriller and kind of turns into a decent movie in the process. The next movie for Washington to release was Mississippi Masala from director Mira Nair and premiered on February 5th, 1992. Mississippi Masala is at its core a story about an Indian woman played by Sarita Choudhury, who begins a romance with a carpet-cleaning businessman played by Denzel Washington. Before watching this, that was pretty much what I knew about the movie, and that it had a pretty great reputation. The movie is much more rich than this though, because there is so much cultural subtext for both the Indian American and African American community. Sarita Choudhury plays Meena, whose family had to relocate to Mississippi after her family was forced to leave Uganda, after the dictator had enacted an order forcing all Asians to leave the country. Since leaving the country almost 20 years ago, her father has still dedicated his life to finding his way back to Uganda. The movie also finds time to address the plight of being a minority in America. Both families have their biases about the other, and that leads to the two families not exactly being the most receptive of this new romantic relationship. I found that to be important because being able to highlight our shortcomings as people is the only way to make those changes. When the focus does shift to Washington, he excels in being a charming potential romantic partner, but also brings the fire to those scenes where he needs to address Meena's family about why they don't like him. That's always a tightrope that he tends to navigate so elegantly. In a recent interview, Mira Nair talked about the process of casting Denzel, when she said, quote, "He had just made one film at that time that I had seen, For Queen and Country. He loved my first film, So he agreed to meet me. When I was telling him the story, he said no one was going to offer him an Asian American story like this. End quote. He clearly saw this as a chance they may not get again. And he ends up delivering a grounded performance where he's able to fit into the tapestry of the movie so well without it ever being distracting by having Denzel in that role. And that's, again, another great part of his career that I think we should focus more on. The other film for Washington in this year was Malcolm X from Spike Lee that released on November 18th, 1992. Leading up to its release in 92, this was a project that had been in development for 24 years before Spike Lee took over. The movie was supposed to be helmed by Norman Jewison, whose films that I've seen and I feel pretty positive about. However, it seems impossible to imagine this movie chronicling the life of Malcolm X being directed by anybody else. There is a bluntness that Lee directs with that makes his films impossible to ignore. All of the subjects that Spike Lee takes on are of the variety where they don't need to be finessed. More times than not, they need to be presented in a complicated way for the audience to absorb. It's an overwhelming movie to watch because it's directed with a sense of energy where the camera is moving more dynamically than you'll see in most biopics. Lee is even able to fit in time for an extended dance sequence at a dance hall. It was also an opportunity for me to learn more about Malcolm X than I had before. Paired with this Denzel Washington performance where he's on screen for 90 to 95% of this 3+ hour runtime. And the mention of the runtime is not a negative, but it works in favor of the movie because it lets the movie feel complete. We see these stages of his life play out that allow for Denzel to play him as a young man having nights on the town, or when he's got to be on the run because he's gotten involved with some shady characters. He also gets to be the doubter of Islam for a portion of the movie, before his conversion that transitions him into this phase as a devout, fearless leader. It's impossible to say enough superlatives to describe what he's doing on screen, but it's a powerhouse performance through and through that was Oscar nominated, but the award eventually went to Al Pacino for Scent of a Woman, which ended up being his first. This brought about some fiery responses from those that felt like Washington was deserving of the hardware, but Washington had this to say shortly after, quote, "I was already 1 for 2 or something. When he won, I was now 1 for 3, and I was okay with that. When I didn't win some of these awards, other people were angry about it. I know it's a cliche, but I was just happy to be invited." I'm sure he knew deep down that he was playing an incredibly important role and playing it masterfully, but it still shows that he didn't want to show up his peers and really make a stink about this. It's an indication of the man that he is and what he's made of, and that made him worthy of playing a role like this for Malcolm X. His next role came in Kenneth Branagh's adaptation of Much Ado About Nothing, that premiered on July 2nd, 1993. This begins a run of supporting performances for Washington, in which he's getting to showcase some of his different actor skills. In this, he tackles Shakespeare and rises to the occasion with his star-studded cast that were all up to the task and seemed to have so much fun in the process. One of the producers even remarked, quote, "We weren't aiming specifically at blind casting, we were just aiming at good casting. Denzel has that nobility in him and you absolutely believed him as a prince," end quote. I think mission accomplished for good casting when you have Emma Thompson, Kenneth Branagh, Keanu Reeves, Michael Keaton, Kate Beckinsale, 90s stalwart Robert Sean Leonard, and then you have Denzel. Most of the action revolves around Thompson, Branagh, Leonard, and Beckinsale. However, the main role that Washington gets to play is he's the Cupid for Branagh and Thompson, and he is so dang delightful that the prose of Shakespeare feels so natural with what you're watching. One of the biggest recommends for me of the series has to be Much Ado About Nothing. It may be a small role for Denzel, but he definitely makes the most of it. December 17th, 1993 saw the premiere of The Pelican Brief from director Alan J. Pakula. This features previous episode subject Julia Roberts slightly prior to the time period we discussed, and this is another star vehicle for her in the wake of Pretty Woman's success. Roberts is a law school student that is tracking down a coincidence of why 2 Supreme Court justices have all of a sudden dropped dead. And on the other side of the narrative, you have Washington playing a reporter who is researching the same coincidence from his own angle. I imagine this was appealing for Washington since he was a journalism major for a period of time at Fordham University. I don't know how true to life his performance tracks with real-life journalists, but he seemed dialed in throughout. All in all, this is a pretty straightforward follow the clues movie where our characters are moving location to location, trying to find the next clue of where they should be looking to unravel the mystery. Luckily, Washington and Roberts are appealing to watch play off each other from scene to scene without ever having a romantic connection. Washington actually insisted that there be no romantic relationship in the movie script, in contrast to the novel it's based off of. One of the finer points for Washington here is his great phone acting. He is so skilled at holding the phone with his shoulder up against his ear while he's multitasking with the other hand, especially when it comes to writing. It's something he clearly has a natural talent with that he is able to translate it to the screen. While this was an enjoyable watch, I think the enduring legacy of the movie is that Julia Roberts gets to have the best law school student name of all time, Derbyshire. The final movie in 1993 for Washington came on December 22nd, 1993 with Jonathan Demme's Philadelphia. This was a rewatch for me from not too many years ago, but I had still forgotten some of the finer points of the movie. Philadelphia tells the story of a lawyer, played by Tom Hanks, that is suspiciously fired from his law firm that he thinks is in connection to his co-workers finding out about his AIDS diagnosis. Hanks' character employs a lawyer, played by Washington, who is having to overcome some of his own biases in his journey to try and get justice for his fellow lawyer. Despite Hanks being the clear lead of the movie, Washington still gets plenty to do, and crucially, especially at this time, is playing the audience surrogate of sorts by getting to ask questions to Hanks' character that the American public would clearly be wondering. For instance, before taking the case, Washington asks him, quote, "Why don't you tell your employer about your diagnosis? Don't you have an obligation?" End quote. This is just as much about Washington covering with the American public as it is about talking to Hanks. When the movie turns to the trial portion of the proceedings, we get to watch Washington weave through the nuances of the case in a practical and understanding manner. Tom Hanks had some lofty praise for Washington when he said, quote, "I sat beside him for 3 weeks shooting the trial. I had no dialogue. It was a thriller of an acting class. He follows no rules but pursues the moment. No nonsense, but a looseness that can't be faked. A one-on-one scene with him is a game of hardball catch. He is both daring you to keep up and propelling you to do more." End quote. That's the difficulty with a movie when you're playing the trial attorney, is you have so many one-on-one scenes as you're questioning the witness that you have these different people that you have to calibrate yourself towards. In this case, Washington is the same character with each questioning period, and he is bringing the same energy no matter who he is talking to. This is another movie that fits in the category of it doesn't need to get cute with nuance. The story is telling is so important in itself. The movie wants to spend ample time having frank conversations with these two men so that you are fully understanding of the battle that is happening, one in the courtroom and one for Hanks' mortal survival. Earlier I talked about how Washington was just concerned with working on good movies, and this exemplifies that for me. This is still a juicy role, but the fact that he's willing to act in service of it shines through in so many powerful ways for the narrative, and still plays as one of his best roles to date, even to this day. My biggest surprise of these watches for me has to be Crimson Tide, released on May 2nd, 1995, from director Tony Scott. It wasn't that I thought this was going to be a bad movie. I'd only heard great things about it, and I think Tony Scott is able to inject a propulsive energy into any plot. Even knowing these things, Crimson Tide exceeded my expectations in almost every way. To put it simply, this is a movie where Washington plays a younger officer that is jockeying for control of a submarine from an older statesman in Gene Hackman. One of the great aspects of this is that the movie lets you figure out the exact power dynamics of how the submarine works. At its core, this is about two men that are trying to do the right thing and do their jobs to the best of their abilities. They have just had different life experiences that have brought them to different conclusions. The tension of this matter is dialed all the way up when the decision that the two men are having to collaborate on is whether or not to launch a nuclear strike on their enemies. This was the first in a series of movies that Washington has this older adversary, where you feel like the conversations reach a combative nature at a certain point. Washington and Hackman are a great match in this instance because Washington is able to encompass that young, confident energy that won't allow him to roll over to Hackman. As for Hackman, it's not as much about confidence, but rather that he would be too proud to admit any kind of surrender to Washington at this point. All of these dynamics make for fireworks in the scenes that they share together, but also brings a bittersweet taste to the final scene where Hackman retires and cedes control of his submarine to Washington. The movie itself has a lot of jargon and could easily fly by the audience at any moment, but the narrative never spins too far away from basic human nature on screen, with these two men that are refusing to step down, knowing that it would symbolize that loss of power. And for Hackman and Washington, they are both able to be so dialed into that moment that you can see it from both sides, which, honestly, that's what makes for a good movie there, is when you know that both sides have a point, but both sides are actually kind of wrong in the process too. The next movie came on August 4th, 1995, from director Brett Leonard with Virtuosity. Let me warn you before briefly summarizing the plot that this is absolute nonsense, and I'm pretty sure the movie knows it. So, some experimental artificial intelligence that houses the personality of many serial killers, played by Russell Crowe, is able to escape into an android body, and it is up to former police officer Denzel Washington to stop its reign of terror. That's one of those plots that after you say it out loud, you say, I guess that's what the movie was about. All in all, it seems like the team knew the movie they were making was silly, but they wanted to keep things moving and provide some cool action set pieces to go along with it. I think that goal is accomplished, but any of the moments where they could have taken some time to reckon with the technology and its implications were either shrugged off or used for some male-serving sexual purpose. I'm not here to indict this movie, because this is far from the only movie at the time that had leanings in this manner. but it did take away from treating it merely as a fun romp. Instead, I kept wanting that little bit more. When it comes to Washington, he is definitely doing the job that's being asked of him, and he has a great rapport with Russell Crowe, but I'm still left not really knowing what all of this is serving. I can see him looking at this movie as an intriguing opportunity as it lets him dip into the sci-fi genre a little, but I think the result ends up being my least favorite performance of his from this run, mostly because it isn't utilizing anything specifically special about Washington during its runtime and just kind of treats him as any other action star, and quite frankly, that's a mistake when you get Denzel Washington to sign on to your movie. This brings us to the final movie of the run with Carl Franklin's Devil in a Blue Dress, released on September 25th, 1995. This was a rewatch for me, and I think for whatever reason this resonated a lot more on this go-around. In the movie, Washington is hired to investigate the disappearance of a woman associated with mayoral candidate in the city. There is nothing outwardly spectacular about this character that Washington is playing. He seems to be an average guy living in LA at the time. The defining feature for him is that he's just trying to survive and be able to pay his mortgage for the next month. How could you get any more down to earth than that? That's a rationale that can resonate with any audience. But that doesn't mean his character is devoid of flaws, though. He operates in this gray area in a couple of different ways. He is dealing with individuals that don't want to be seen for too long and are quick to rush him along to his next task, and he's just trying to do the right thing. This portrait of LA is not focused on the glitz and glamour, but rather what is happening behind the scenes and what people are willing to do to get ahead. This mystery is easy to follow while allowing us as the audience to be able to still be left with questions, as we are never really privy to more information than what Denzel knows. This watch was absolutely immersive for me and left me feeling satisfied by the entire experience. I was a little puzzled by the conclusion because it was very neat and tidy for a movie that doesn't exactly support that kind of narrative. But then when I looked further into it, Carl Franklin had apparently acquired the rights to the book series, and he had the intention of making this into a series of movies about this private investigator, and that didn't get to come to fruition. And that really pieced things together for me, because I think it would have turned into a great series, and especially if you have Denzel signed on, you would of course want to continue making movies in that series. So it's a little disappointing that we never got to see those movies in that way, but it was still a great portrait of the kinds of characters that Denzel can play and plays so well. So I think Devil in a Blue Dress may not have had the long-lasting legacy that Carl Franklin would have hoped for, but I do think that individually as a piece of itself, Devil in a Blue Dress is a great movie with a great Denzel performance. When looking at these 9 movies altogether, I think you're getting the full Denzel Washington experience. You are getting to see him deliver in dramas with lead and supporting roles. You also get to see him bring some different skills to the table with genre pieces that at first may not seem like they fit him, but he is Denzel Washington after all, and he makes them fit. I'm not breaking any news by waxing poetic about the brilliance of Washington, but this era of films is getting to see him deliver unique performances in each movie that makes them a special experience and really starts the genre of Denzel movies, because you don't feel like you're just getting a repeat performance or leftovers from something else he's done. No surprise here, Denzel Washington makes enjoyable movies. So thanks for joining me on this episode of 5 Year Windows. If you could, leave a like on the video and subscribe down below. It would be greatly appreciated, and we'll keep you in the loop for when the next video drops. If you have some other actors or actresses you would like to see covered on the show, leave those suggestions down below in the comments. Our subject next week is going to be the career of Al Pacino from 1971 to 1975. And again, thanks so much for watching and have a great day.